Captain Robert Mitchell had been flying commercial aircraft for 32 years. At 58 years old, he'd seen just about everything the skies could throw at him. Thunderstorms over the Rockies, engine failures, emergency landings. He'd handled them all with the steady calm that comes from experience. But nothing in all those years had prepared him for what was about to happen on Flight 227. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The kind of day when the autumn sun filters through the clouds just right, painting everything golden. Robert was piloting the regional jet from Denver to Kansas City, a route he'd flown hundreds of times. His co-pilot, a capable young man named Derek, sat beside him running through the standard checks. In seat 14A sat 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez. She had wavy brown hair that fell past her shoulders and wore a light blue hoodie with a stuffed pink bear tucked under her arm. Her eyes were the color of a clear summer sky, bright and curious about everything. Emma was traveling alone, a first-time unaccompanied minor, to visit her grandmother in Kansas City. The flight attendant, a kind woman named Patricia, had checked on her twice already. Emma seemed perfectly content, looking out the window at the clouds below, talking softly to her stuffed bear. The flight had been smooth for the first 40 minutes. They'd reached their cruising altitude of 15,000 feet. And Robert had just taken a sip of his coffee when the first warning light flickered on the instrument panel. Then another. Then the whole board lit up like a Christmas tree. What the? Derek leaned forward, his hands moving quickly across the controls. Robert's heart rate kicked up, but his voice remained steady. Talk to me, Derek. What are we looking at? Hydraulic failure. Primary and secondary systems. Captain, we're losing. The plane lurched violently to the left. Robert gripped the yoke, pulling hard, but it felt like stirring concrete. The aircraft wasn't responding. 32 years of training kicked in automatically. He tried the backup systems. Nothing. The plane began to roll, slowly at first, then faster. Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 227. Derek spoke rapidly into the radio, his voice tight with controlled panic. We have complete hydraulic failure at 15,000 feet. We are losing control of the aircraft. In the cabin, oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments. Passengers gasped. Some screamed. Patricia moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency, her voice calm and firm, helping people secure their masks, preparing them for the worst. Emma sat very still in her seat, her small hands gripping her stuffed bear. She wasn't crying, wasn't screaming like some of the other passengers. She was watching, listening, thinking. Up in the cockpit, Robert and Derek worked frantically, trying every procedure, every backup, every trick they'd learned in decades of flying. Nothing worked. The plane was rolling, losing altitude, and there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. Robert had never given up on a flight in his entire career. But as he watched the altimeter spin downward, as he felt the complete absence of control, a terrible realization settled over him like a heavy blanket. They were going to crash. He looked at Derek, whose face had gone pale. The younger man was still trying, still fighting with the controls, but Robert could see he knew it too. Derek, Robert said quietly, it's time to tell the passengers. Derek's hands stilled on the controls. He nodded slowly, understanding what Robert meant. It was time to let people say their goodbyes, make their peace. But before Robert could reach for the intercom, something extraordinary happened. The cockpit door, which should have been locked, clicked open. Patricia stood there, her face flushed. Captain, I'm sorry, but there's a little girl who... Emma stepped around Patricia and into the cockpit. Sweetie, you can't be in here, Robert said, his voice gentle despite the emergency. Please go back to your seat and... My daddy's an airplane mechanic, Emma said, her young voice clear and steady. She held her pink bear against her chest. He works on planes like this one. Big planes. He taught me things. Emma, honey, we need you to... Derek started. The hydraulic lines, Emma interrupted, pointing to the instrument panel. Those red lights. Daddy showed me. Sometimes when all the lights come on like that, it's not all broken. Sometimes it's just the computer that tells the plane what's broken. He calls it a sensor cascade. Robert stared at this 7-year-old child who'd just used the term sensor cascade correctly. The plane shuddered around them, rolling further. Emma, he said carefully, what did your daddy tell you about that? He said sometimes you have to reset it. Like when our computer at home freezes and Mom has to turn it off and on again. She pointed to a panel Robert hadn't even thought to check. He said there's a manual reset. A button. Behind that panel there. Robert looked where she was pointing. It was the backup electrical reset panel. Something he'd only read about in technical manuals. Something pilots almost never used because it meant shutting down and restarting. Critical systems mid-flight. It was dangerous. It could make things worse. But they were already going down. Robert looked at Derek. Derek looked back. In that moment, they both understood. They had nothing to lose. Patricia, please take Emma back to her seat and make sure she's secure, Robert said. But will you try it? Emma asked, her eyes wide and hopeful. The reset button? Like my daddy said? Robert reached out and gently touched the top of her head. You're a very smart girl, Emma. Your daddy taught you well. Now please go with Patricia. Everything's going to be all right. Patricia led Emma back to the cabin, and Robert turned to Derek. You thinking what I'm thinking? That a 7-year-old girl might have just solved what we couldn't? Derek said. Yeah, I'm thinking it. Robert's hands moved to the panel Emma had indicated. He unscrewed it quickly, exposing a series of circuit breakers and, yes, a red manual reset button that he'd honestly forgotten existed. If this doesn't work, Derek began. If it doesn't work, we were going down anyway, Robert said. Here goes everything. He pressed the button. For 3 seconds, everything went dark. The cockpit instruments went black. The engine's hum changed pitch. The plane fell in silence. Then, like a miracle, the systems came back online. The hydraulic pressure gauge jumped. The warning lights blinked out, one by one. Robert grabbed the yoke and felt blessed relief, resistance, control. I've got it, he shouted. Derek, I've got the plane. He pulled up, steadying their descent, leveling out their roll. The plane responded like it had just woken from a bad dream. All the systems, all the controls working perfectly. It had been a sensor cascade failure, exactly as Emma had said. The sensors had failed and told the computer that everything was broken, which shut down systems that were actually working fine. The reset had cleared the false readings. Robert guided the plane back to level flight at 10,000 feet. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline catching up with him. He'd been flying for 32 years. And a 7-year-old child had just taught him something that saved all their lives. They landed in Kansas City 17 minutes later. It was the smoothest landing Robert had ever made, his gratitude flowing through every gentle adjustment. When the plane reached the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, Robert left the cockpit. The passengers were standing, gathering their things, many of them still shaken, some crying with relief. Emma sat in seat 14A, her stuffed bear on her lap, looking out the window at the terminal. Robert walked down the aisle and knelt beside her seat. The entire cabin grew quiet, watching. Emma, he said softly, you saved us. You saved everyone on this plane? Do you understand that? Emma looked at him with those clear blue eyes. I just remembered what my daddy taught me. He says it's important to listen when people teach you things. You never know when you might need them. Robert felt tears prick his eyes, something that hadn't happened in years. Your daddy is a very wise man, and you're a very brave girl. I wasn't brave, Emma said simply. I was just trying to help. That's what brave is, sweetheart, Robert said. It's helping even when you're scared. The passengers began to applaud, softly at first, then louder. Emma looked around, confused by the attention, hugging her pink bear tighter. Patricia came over, tears streaming down her face, and hugged Emma gently. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. After everyone had deplaned, Robert called Emma's grandmother, who was waiting anxiously at the gate. He explained what had happened, and through her tears of relief and pride, she asked to speak to Emma. Robert handed Emma his phone. She listened for a moment, then said, Yes, Grandma. Yes, I remembered. Daddy's lessons. I know, Grandma. I love you too. Before Emma left with her grandmother, Robert gave her something. His pilot's wings pin, the one he'd worn for 32 years. You're an honorary co-pilot now, he told her. The best one I've ever flown with. Emma looked at the gold wings in her small palm, then up at Robert. Can I really keep it? Forever, Robert said. And Emma? When you talk to your daddy tonight, you tell him that Captain Robert Mitchell says thank you. Tell him he raised an amazing daughter. Tell him his lessons saved 147 lives today. Emma nodded seriously. pinning the wings carefully to her blue hoodie. That evening, as Robert drove home to his wife, he thought about his long career. All the flights, all the challenges, all the times he'd relied on his experience and training. Today, he'd been humbled by a child. Today, he'd learned that wisdom doesn't always come with age, that courage doesn't always roar, and that sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one we need to hear most. He'd also learned something else, something he already knew but had forgotten in the routine of his years. To never stop teaching, never stop learning, and never underestimate the power of a parent's love expressed through patient lessons shared with a curious child. Emma's father had taught her about airplanes not knowing she'd ever need it. He'd taught her simply because she was interested, because he loved her, because passing on knowledge is one of the greatest gifts we can give. That night, Emma called her daddy from her grandmother's house. She told him about the flight, about the lights, about remembering his lessons. And her daddy, a humble mechanic who worked third shift fixing planes, cried on the phone holding his wife's hand, thanking God his little girl was safe. The next morning, the story made national news. 7-year-old saves flight, the headlines read. But Emma didn't care much about being famous. She cared that she'd helped. She cared that her daddy's lessons had mattered. And Captain Robert Mitchell, who had 53 more flights before his retirement, approached each one differently after that day. He listened more carefully. He appreciated the small voices. He never forgot that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. And he never, ever forgot the little girl in seat 14A, who reminded him why he loved flying in the first place. Because in the sky, we're all in it together. And sometimes it takes a child to show us how to find our way home.